Tim Kaine has been a mayor, a governor, and a United States Senator from Virginia. A member of the Foreign Relations and Armed Services Committee, he was the driving force behind authorizing the war against the Islamic State, which was cleared by the committee this week. Senator Kaine, it's awfully nice to have you here.
Al, great to be with you.
10-8 vote in the Foreign Relations Committee. That's not exactly a ringing endorsement for a policy, is it?
Well, it wasn't the vote that I hoped, but in a sense, I have been trying for months to get there to be a vote. The president initiated this war against ISIL on the 8th of August. We're now into month 5 of a war, $1 billion, 1,500 combat advisors on the ground in Iraq, growing to 3,000. 3 Americans have already been killed in Operation Inherent Resolve, and Congress hadn't even had a discussion or a committee hearing or vote until we did it, and we've done it, and now I do believe it is the will of both bodies, both parties. We have to authorize this war. We can't allow the president to do it.
Except it's not going to happen in this Congress, which you thought it was essential that it does.
I am. I'm disappointed that we didn't get to it quicker, but the fact of the Foreign Relations Committee's well-thought-out authorization, I think that will become the default version when we get to it and eventually pass it in January.
Well, Senator Bob Corker, a Republican, takes over the Foreign Relations Committee in January, and if you take it up again then, what modifications, what changes, what differences would you expect in that resolution?
You know, the guts of this resolution were the mission that the president described to the American public on the evening of September 10th, battling ISIL in Iraq and Syria. We put a sunset provision on it, saying that there would need to be a reauthorization within 3 years or it would expire. I don't think that will be controversial with the new Senate. I'll tell you, the one point of controversy is what we put in, which was a limitation on ground troops. The president said 5 different times to the American public, this will not be an exercise where we will put American ground troops into combat missions in Iraq or Syria. So we wrote the authorization to say that. It's not only a good idea because the president said it, it's a good idea because people like former Secretary Gates has said putting big numbers of ground troops into military missions in the Middle East is a big mistake. But there are some on the Republican side.
Didn't you? You created some exceptions.
Yes.
If it was necessary to protect U.S. personnel or operations on a limited basis.
And the other exception that's probably important is since we're doing airstrikes, ground troops to spot and tell the airstrikes, hey, here's the best place to go to damage the right folks but minimize civilian casualties. We can use combat forces for that. So there are some limited exceptions, but there are those on the other side who want it to be a more robust possibility of including ground troop operations.
Does that limitation satisfy what Secretary Kerry asked for a week or so ago before your committee?
Secretary Kerry came and testified and said this proposal is very close to what we would like. Now, he wasn't wild about the ground troop piece, but he kept saying, well, because what about if this happens? And we looked at the exception and said, well, that would be covered by this exception. So clearly they're worried about contingencies, and in war there are going to be contingencies that we didn't think of. But we think we've crafted exceptions that are significant enough. But if the president decides, contrary to what I said to the American people, this is now a mission that really does require significant use of ground troops, we want the president to have to come back to Congress, make that case to the Congress and the American public, and we could authorize that expansion. But we think the limitation is an important one to begin with.
Senator Kaine, as I understand it, the administration had almost no input in the committee's deliberation. 5 months after declaring a war against the Islamic State, why can the White House not give you a plan or a strategy or a language for what kind of authorization they'd like?
Al, it troubles me deeply. You know, I'm a supporter of the White House, but on this particular issue, I've kind of been mixing it up with them since June when the White House started to talk about the need for military action against ISIL. I said, don't think you can do this without Congress. The president has said, I would welcome congressional involvement. After the election on November 5th, I think it's important that we work on an authorization. But unlike other instances, the White House did not send over a draft authorization that described the mission. Usually that's how this starts. The president would give a speech like he did on September 10th. We need to battle ISIL. The president would send over a draft proposal. Congress would have hearings. We would debate. We would probably edit or revise it, and we would vote. They didn't send up an authorization. That meant that we had to draft one based upon our best read of the situation.
Do you think that reflects their ambivalence on this policy?
You know, I don't know whether it reflects ambivalence or whether it reflects a concern based on previous experiences. Well, whatever we send to Congress, that's going to be the one thing they won't do. They may have been reluctant to hand Congress something, then that would be what Congress would want to oppose. Regardless, whether the Article 2 branch does what it's supposed to do or not, the Article 1 branch has a responsibility. The Constitution clearly states you can't start a war without Congress, and there's good reasons for that.
We've been doing it for years.
Sadly, whether presidents or Congresses or Democrat, Republican, Whig, or Federalist, presidents overreach, and Congresses often say, well, you know, if I can avoid voting on this, it may be politically beneficial not to do something that could be unpopular. But that is so unfair to those men and women who serve. If we're going to ask them to risk their lives, and there have been 3 deaths already, if we're going to ask them to risk their lives, then we ought to at least debate and say this mission is in the national interest. If we say that, then we can fairly ask that sacrifice. But if we're not willing to do it, then we shouldn't ask that sacrifice.
As I understand this measure, it would repeal the 2002 authority or resolution for the war against Iraq, but not the 2001.
Yes.
Is that correct?
Very
is that
important.
What you hope happens when they take it up next year?
The one challenge is, you know, you have these authorizations, the Al-Qaeda authorization from 01 and the Iraq authorization from 02. They're still out there and active, and they've never been repealed. So the question is, it kind of can create a confusing pattern of, well, is this authorized? Is it double authorized? Is this unauthorized? So in our authorization against ISIL, we did 2 things. With the Iraq authorization from 02, we repealed it. The administration supports that. They've come and testified to our committee. We ought to repeal the 02 authorization. With the 01 authorization, which is the broader authorization to go after Al-Qaeda, we don't repeal it, but we say this will have a 3-year sunset. We should work with the administration to find, you know, is there a version of the authorization that we need going forward to fight terrorist groups wherever they are, but that isn't so open-ended, geographically, open-ended in time. It kind of has led to a perpetual war of now 13 years. So we put a 3-year sunset on the 01 authorization so that we can work with the White House to craft more refined language. That's what the President has called for, and we want to work with him on that.
Do you think Republicans like Senator Corker, Senator Paul, though their views are quite different, are with you on that particular issue?
Yes. Senator Corker actually has done very good work with the White House in dialogue about how can you take that 2001 authorization and narrow it down. And there doesn't seem to be any opposition within the body about repealing the 2002 authorization. So what we did in this package is authorize the war against ISIL, repeal the old 02 authorization, and start that process where we can come up with the better version of the 2001 Al-Qaeda authorization to give us the ability to go after terrorist groups that threaten the United States, but to do it in a more limited and careful way, not so open-ended.
Senator, you are a member of both the Foreign Relations and the Armed Services Committee. How is the war against the Islamic State going?
You know, not only am I a member, but in October, Al, I went with Senator Kaine, who you know. We went to Qatar, to Al Udeid Air Force Base, which is where the Combined Air Campaign is being operated. And it's really interesting. It's a room a little bit like this with, you know, big video screens on the wall, and you walk out on the floor, and there's U.S., Canadian, Dutch, you know, Belgian, German, French, Saudi, Qataris, working together to look at targets in Iraq and Syria and make a decision about, do we have enough intelligence to know these are ISIL forces we should go after? It was extremely impressive. The scope of the coalition, very impressive. The work that Secretary Kerry in the United States has done to help the Iraqi government go from a Maliki-led government that kicked, you know, Sunnis and kicked Kurds around to a more inclusive government, that's been impressive. So I would say that
we're winning.
On the Iraq side, we're making real progress. The part that's the tough part, as you know, is in Syria. Because the civil war in Syria, the atrocities of Bashar al-Assad, the fragmented nature of the opposition is making progress there very difficult. So the way I look at this war against ISIL, it's kind of like when we went into World War II. We didn't just invade Germany. You know, we went to North Africa, then Sicily, then Italy, then in through France, and eventually to Germany. This war is going to have a phase to it. The first important phase will be trying to work together with the Iraqi military and the Kurds to stabilize Iraq, to stabilize the border between Iraq and Syria, to stabilize the border between Syria and other nations like Turkey or Jordan or Lebanon. But then in Syria, the provision of humanitarian aid, we're the largest provider of Syrian aid in the world, training and assisting the appropriate elements of the Syrian opposition. We will do that, and we will look for a moment in the dynamic in Syria where we can move toward a negotiated end to the civil war there. That's going to be the toughest piece. That's going to be the piece where progress will be the slowest, sadly. But it's like other wars where there's phases that are more straightforward and then other challenges that are more difficult.